The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the sponsors, advertisers, or presenters. Advertising does not imply endorsement by the sponsors and presenters.
Hey guys, welcome back to this week's podcast. And this week we have a fantastic guest, Ben Sullivan from CM KLING Associates. Ben is going to tell us a lot more about himself, but he is a lighting controls designer and he is near and dear to Webster and my's heart. So this is going to be a fantastic conversation, but I just want to remind everyone that this episode is presented by the LCA, the Lighting Controls Association.
And it's financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, or NAILD. And if you want to check out other episodes, check out our website, lightingcontrolspodcast.com, where you can see previous episodes, new episodes, check out some news, and maybe even buy some merch. All right, and here's Ben. Welcome back to the Lighting Controls Podcast, everyone, where we just like to talk about lighting controls all the time, every time. Today we have a guest, Ben Sullivan. Ben, do you want to just give us a quick breakdown on who you are and what you do?
Yeah, hi. So as Webster said, my name is Ben Sullivan. I am a lighting controls designer with CM KLING Associates, a lighting design firm in DC. So I was kind of brought on board within our company to focus particularly on how lighting controls will affect lighting design. So that the lighting designers can be freed to actually focus on the lighting aspect of the design, whereas I have the honor and privilege to be able to work just in the realm of controls, which is a really nice field to be in. So I started in the theatrical design world and moved over to architectural lighting a few years ago. And really it's been great so far, getting to enjoy learning and teaching people about controls and the importance of them.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. And I mean, really, that is the reason why I wanted to chat with you on this show, is because your title is lighting controls designer and you're part of a lighting design firm. I mean, that right there is an amazing thing to hear. And I think what you said was really apropos to what we have been hearing on this podcast from lighting designers, is that they don't really want to deal with the controls. They want to deal with the lights. They want to design the lights. And so having somebody in-house to do that lighting controls design has got to be really helpful to them. And so I'm curious, what that dynamic looks like.
Yeah, so it obviously varies from project to project, because some projects are quick. We have to get a really fast turnaround. We put kind of a boilerplate control design and that's it. But for the majority of our projects, we're able to really focus on how controls are going to play into that design and how the end user is going to be interacting with that design. We really put an emphasis on the intersection of the people, architecture, and the environment. The environment being both from a sustainability standpoint and also the built environment that we are creating. And sitting right at the heart of that intersection is really controls. Controls is what ties the lighting together with other architectural elements. It is what the users are actually interacting with on the day-to-day basis. You're not touching the lights on the ceiling, but you are touching a keypad when you walk into a room or flipping a switch. So what we do is put that controls design right at the forefront of our design. So we'll work with clients and architects, engineers, and really figure out, okay, what is the controls intent for this project? How are we going to design a project, controls for a project that really fit the needs of this particular project and aren't just, we're going to slap on system X because we like using them and we know that they work well. We're really taking a deep dive approach to figuring out what it is that meets those requirements that the user has and that will be the best for that project.
I mean, that's amazing. It sounds really idyllic for your clients to have that real focus on making sure that it's a system that meets their needs, as opposed to something that might be an afterthought or wedged in to make it work. And so I'm curious what a project looks like in your experience from the beginning. At the outset, if you're part of the schematic, for instance?
Yeah. So the keyword there being if we're part of the schematic, because
Sure.
sometimes projects don't decide that they need a lighting designer until halfway through design development or CDs, and they realize, oh, we need to get a lighting designer in here to run some calcs and actually plan what we're doing with the lighting in this space. So it's great when we can actually get that involvement from early on in schematic design. And when that happens, we get to sit down with a meeting with the client and really figure out exactly what their needs are and what their past experiences are. Because for a lot of people, the word controls, when coming toward tied towards lighting, brings a lot of apprehension. And people say, well, I had this complex control system in a project before, and it was so hard to use. We're never able to actually get it to work right. We hate having all these controls. I mean, there is that initial understanding of, okay, well, it is the year 2023. There are a lot of code requirements that require at least a baseline level of control. So you can't get away from that. But beyond that, their controls should be there to help the user. It shouldn't be something that's complex and difficult. So we like to actually sit down with clients and walk them through what it is that they're really going to be buying at the end of the day. This control system should not just be they need to have it for code. They need to have it because it really enhances their needs. So we like to talk through what their challenges and their particular requirements are. And then we sit down and really look at what control system will work best for us. So if we know that there's going to be a lot of color changing DMX involvement for some beautiful art displays, we know we're going to have to go with a more complex control system, and that kind of narrows down the original basis of design to a handful of manufacturers. If it's going to be just a standard, they don't really care how the controls work, except they want to integrate with some AV or some shades, we know, okay, well, that narrows it down to a few other manufacturers that we can work with. And we start kind of with that baseline basis of design manufacturer, and then build in those general requirements and specifications that the project needs to have. And then from that, we grow a more holistic design of figuring out, okay, well, what does it look like in every individual space? When you walk into room type X, what happens with the lighting? When you walk into room type Y, what happens with the lighting? So really getting to sit down and do a deep dive and figure out exactly what should be happening in each space based on the project requirements, based on code, and just working with the client and the engineers and architect to really hone in that system that will work for them. And then beyond that, as we get into formal documentation, we like to really make sure we have a very airtight, clean spec that is really specifying what exactly this system needs to do, and what challenges it needs to overcome. And because honestly, one of the biggest challenges within the design world is making sure that you have a spec that can be adhered to. And if the control system doesn't meet the specs that were originally set out to achieve, then you have a lot of pitfalls there where the system might not work as you intended, and then all the work that you did early on in design just kind of falls apart. And then just kind of going through the later design phases, we stay very involved all throughout the construction design process. As we enter into construction and construction administration, we're very involved in monitoring how things are getting submitted, responding to RFIs as they come in to make sure that the system is being built the way that we specified and the way that we intended. And then finally kind of going on site and checking every single control component, making sure it was designed, it was installed as designed and is functioning the way that we intended it to. So that goes from just the physical devices in the space, like a keypad or a sensor being located where we wanted it to be located, all the way to how are the particular drivers functioning with this control system? Are the drivers dimming the way that we want from this fixture? And if we determine that it's not functioning, the system isn't functioning the way that we intended, then it's my job to kind of go back to the manufacturers and say, hey, why aren't your products functioning the way that they should be functioning with this system? So really, it is a very detailed, holistic process that we involve controls in, where every single one of our projects, we try to keep this very detailed list of controls deliverables that we want to meet as we move through design, so that we continue to keep up that original design intent that we discuss with the owner early on in design.
I love everything about this, right? Like, as an integrator, if I could just work on your projects, I would be the happiest person in the world, right? Like, it's amazing. We hear so much from various lighting design firms that they either don't have controls or they want nothing to do with it, right? And it gets sourced to the EE or whoever ends up being responsible, if anybody, if there's any controls designer. There's plenty of times there isn't one, or it falls to the integrator or whoever has to pick up the ball. So it's amazing to hear that your company has taken that approach and that you guys are that hands-on and that documented just through the whole process. I'm curious though, just knowing the other side of the coin, do you ever get any pushback from electrical engineers regarding you guys handling the whole design and handling that all the way through?
Absolutely. I would say, and I love engineers. I love working with electrical engineers, but there is sort of a different mindset between the designer's side approach versus the engineer's approach. The engineer is often focusing simply on what do we need to achieve code, how are we powering up these fixtures, and all they really want to see is they need some zoning from us and some basic system intent, and then they're going to go ahead and design the system. We try to have discussions early on with to coordinate with the engineers, and that's been successful with a number of the engineers where we work with, where I'll just hop on a call as I'm laying out my zoning and my keypads and just say, hey, here's what I'm looking at. Here's why we're doing it this way. Does this make sense to you? And once we have those conversations, it usually is a lot easier for them to say, oh, okay, so we're working in Revit. You have these this zoning property tagged to your fixture. We'll just absorb your fixtures into our model, absorb your zones, and be able to make all of our panel schedules based on what you have there. We definitely run into challenges sometimes when we're not able to have those conversations, either due to a quick construction process where we have a very fast design and there just isn't time to have those meetings and sit down, where we'll reach the 100% set and we'll be looking back and reviewing the electrical documents and see, well, why do none of their zones match what we have on our lighting sheets? And why did they locate a sensor in this room where we said this has to be on time clock because the client doesn't want a bunch of sensors in this lobby? And then we have to go back and forth and try to get things buttoned up before any IFC sets go out, and just to prevent all the headaches that will arise when the electrical drawings don't match the lighting drawings. And it's a real obstacle that we have to deal with. It still happens from time to time where we miss something in coordination, but for the most part, we work very hard to make sure that we are getting a clean, consistent set between the lighting sheets, the electrical sheets, and the architectural sheets as we push through to get a final construction set out.
But I mean, that's part of the job as a lighting designer in general, coordinating lighting fixtures or coordinating lighting controls. I mean, I guess it's just not a common thing that, a lighting designer is going to say, well, move that keypad or move that sensor or do this with your lighting control system, because that typically falls into the scope of the electrical engineer.
Exactly. So it's often kind of back and forth with the engineers. Some engineers are more willing to give us that scope area than others. Some want to say, hey, we're the ones stamping the drawings. We need to be the ones locating the sensors and keypads. Mm-hmm. You can give some general guidance, but we don't want to see your keypads and sensors on sheets. I will say it's a little bit, as we've been growing this controls design, we've been able to swing a lot more engineers onto the side of, well, look, we're putting a keypad on this side of that door rather than this side of that doorway because of this reason. The flow as you walk into this room makes more sense for the keypad to be located here rather than just whatever boilerplate document the engineers will do when they're stamping in their keypad locations. Or we're saying, hey, we're looking at this manufacturer's sensor requirements. It has to be 6 feet away from any HVAC equipment. we located it there and still put it in a place where it can pick someone up as they walk through the door and has good coverage throughout the room. Where you located it, it is 2 feet away from a event, and it is
Or something.
not going to pick someone up as they walk in the door, and that's just going to create problems. We are very intentional about where we are placing the sensors and keypads.
Sure.
Sometimes it's just a matter of we get a general markup showing where all those locations are, but more and more we have been physically modeling in sensors and keypads into our Revit files, and we work with the engineers to say, okay, absorb our devices into your model. If you need to shift things around based on some sort of coordination issues, let's go. We'll hop on a call and figure out, well, maybe this sensor needs to move because the annunciator for the fire alarm has to go there for whatever reason, or maybe a sprinkler head has to go there. So let's figure out a different place for this sensor. And we have those conversations on a lot of our projects where we'll just sit down with every discipline and walk through where are these devices going, and we'll just be sending blue beam documents back and forth, marking everything up. And really, we are trying to take ownership of that design, though, and making sure that we're
on top of, having to monitor all this information and coordinate all of it. It sounds like you also need to almost train the people you're working with to shift their focus and expectations because of the fact that this is such a change to the norm. And so you're kind of acting as a missionary in a way to convert people to thinking in this way that, yes, lighting designers can actually dictate lighting controls at the same time.
Yeah, missionary is a very good word for it.
I
trying
love
to bring the good news of lighting controls to the rest of the construction industry. Yeah, I mean, it definitely takes a lot of persuasion to really be able to convince people that there's a reason why the lighting designer is taking ownership of the lighting controls. We're looking at things holistically from how the lighting will function, and not just what code requirements do we need to meet, what purpose does this room serve in terms of lead requirements or well requirements. Like, we are really looking at all of the elements that are associated directly with lighting, and then beyond that, how those elements go beyond just lighting. So do we need to tie into a BMS system to use our occupancy sensors? We try to take ownership of that so that it's not stuff that gets lost in coordination, because no one wants to be the one to actually coordinate all these systems. Good example of a project I was at a couple months ago. We walked into a conference room and we said, why are there 3 different occupancy sensors on the ceiling? There's a lighting sensor, a sensor for the AV system, and another sensor for the BMS system. Why wasn't this coordinated? It's stuff like that we are really looking at. Hey, let's look at this early in design or early in CDs and say, hey, the lighting control system can do this. And potentially, depending on the manufacturer we're working with, their sensor looks a little bit nicer than the whatever AV system or BMS system, whatever sensor they're putting on the ceiling. This is a higher end conference room. Let's go with the nicer looking sensor that can do all of this and has that robust ability to really sense the occupancy within that space and transmit that data out to other systems.
Well, as the controls designer, it's got to be a little easier to convert some of those engineers and other parties by being the subject matter expert. And like the example you gave of, hey, this sensor needs to be 6 feet from a diffuser, right? That's not something your average engineer is going to pay attention to. And it's that exact example is the reason we've heard across, for so many years of so many potential issues with lighting systems. Hey, this room works, but this room doesn't. Well, right, that sensor is in a bad spot in that room because the room layout is just slightly different and the diffuser's here, or that other light fixture is blocking its view or whatever. So it's got to be a little easier for you to convert some of those people when you can step up to the plate with that knowledge and say, hey, here's the reason we did this, not just your boilerplate. It's this big of a room. This sensor covers this much coverage. We're going to put it right in the middle of the grid.
Exactly. Yeah. So we really I try and take a fully uh, holistic approach into looking at the control system and all the components that we're working with. And if we're specing control system X, I check all their cut sheets, figure out all the requirements of their components, and make sure that whatever our basis of design system is it's going to work based on the way that we're laying out the devices. Which always works for when we're working with the system that we specify, but then we run into the trouble of, well, what happens when our system gets subbed out to something else? Then I have to take the deep dive of looking into the other manufacturer that gets subbed in and making sure that, hey, we placed a sensor there, but their sensor has a different coverage pattern than what we're working with, and we need to reconsider where this sensor goes. So then it's, as we're reviewing submittals, we say, well, no, that sensor would have worked there if we were using manufacturer A, but now that this is manufacturer B, that sensor can't work there. So we're really taking ownership of making sure those comments get put into documents, and because it's typically not something that the engineer is going to be looking for. And what we really want to focus on is
on
go
that
ahead.
Point though. You know, I've heard so many arguments from the opposite side of that by saying, well, it's the manufacturer's responsibility to make sure that they have the coverage they need, and I shouldn't be dictating where the sensors go.
Yeah, but then the contractor installs it where they see fit, and it doesn't. Even if the manufacturer took all the time to lay out where all those sensors go, it's gonna that does not mean that that's going to be where it's installed in the field. So if we actually are locating sensors on our construction documents and being able to say, look, the sensor's here on the contract documents, it's not in a shop drawing that was provided to you by the manufacturer for where this sensor needed to go. We are saying this sensor has to go here, or this panel has to go in this room rather than in this room. We're making sure that we are really thinking about that stuff so that it gets captured in the contract documents and not just in a set of shop drawings from the manufacturer that the contractor doesn't necessarily need to follow exactly.
Yeah, I mean,
there's really
we've all been there where the contractor gets the submittal and they follow the submittal despite the fact that the drawings already have sensor locations, but the submittal was just kind of thrown, all the symbols were just thrown on there to show intent.
Yes.
Yeah, if you're looking at one of the like a floor plan layout on a control submittal that we are returning with our comments, you'll see arrows everywhere of move this sensor here, move this sensor here, move this sensor here, because the manufacturer may not have placed their sensors where we indicated them on the drawings. But we have a good relationship with a lot of controls manufacturers, and we'll work with them prior to submittals even going out, and we'll send them a copy of their control system laid out on our plans and say, okay, there's a reason why we're putting the sensor here. So when you submit this system, please follow what we are showing on our drawings. And typically we get good response from the manufacturers because they want to work with us and we have those good relationships. So it is helpful as a designer having those relationships with manufacturers where you're able to make sure that things get coordinated better than if you're working with some generic manufacturer who you don't necessarily have as good of a relationship with and doesn't understand your design requirements and the way you handle things as you move through the design.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that is the ideal relationship there, where the manufacturer is there to support you and make sure that everything is going to be met with all the intent is met and all the functionality is met. And if I imagine if you send them a drawing and they're like, whoa, wait a second, what are you doing here? You know, that would be a conversation. That wouldn't just be like, well, we'll figure it out in CDs or in CA.
Exactly. Yeah. So we like having those back and forth discussions with the manufacturers and of saying, here's our design intent. Will this work? And they might say, well, maybe we might need to look at a different approach. At which point we'll say, all right, yeah, let's see with this route rather than this route of laying out these devices. As long as we're still meeting our original design intent that we discussed with the client, and that really it is going back to those owner requirements and that owner intent that we discuss with the client of saying, this is how your system's going to be functioning. We always keep that in mind as we're moving through the design. If we have to change something, will the system still function the way that we originally designed it? And if the answer is yes, then okay, we're open to small changes here and there. But if the answer is no, we need to take a step back and say, well, look, we spec'd this particular shade interface because we knew that it would work with that shade manufacturer. You've changed the lighting control system, and now that lighting control system won't work with this shade manufacturer. So now we need to take a step back and figure out, okay, how are these two systems going to talk to each other now? So
yeah, so I mean, the other thing here is it sounds like you're not just reviewing the electrical sheets during coordination. It sounds like you're reviewing other sheets as well.
Correct. It depends on the project and depends on what is involved there. If we know that there's some low voltage drawings that are going to be showing devices that need to be integrated with our system, we'll skim them over and say, well, look, you're specifying shade manufacturer Y in this section. We know that shade manufacturer X will work better with the manufacturer that we're working with the lighting system. And we know that the owner wants to be able to just go to a keypad on the wall and press a button and the shades and the lighting all go to a certain preset. So we have to make sure that we are getting that level of integration. And ultimately we put a strong emphasis on let's get those things coordinated so that it's not halfway through construction and we're looking at something and we realize, oh no, we can't, this shade system is not going to talk with the lighting system. We're now going to have to add a bunch more keypads for the shading controls that no one planned for. Which does still happen from time to time when we aren't able to get into that extra level of review. I would say the biggest challenge that we really face is the time crunch on a lot of these projects that have a really quick turnaround, and we can't really take the time to review all the documents that we want. Because we also are still kind of growing this controls integration division within our company of saying, look, we are trying to take a holistic approach to controls. Let's build in that time for the design for us to actually look at that, and we can take ownership of that. So when we're able to do that, things work great. You walk into the space, the lighting works the way you want it to, it interfaces with the shades the way that you want it to, it talks to the BMS system the way that it wants to, and no issues at all. But when we don't have that time, that's where you start running into issues.
Another thing that I'm curious about here is something that other people push back on, which is emergency controls. Now, do you do emergency lighting controls?
Yes and no. So again, since we're not the ones stamping the drawings for permit, there's only so much that we can really get away with doing with controls for emergency. The engineer really needs to take final ownership of saying, this light, and this light have to be on emergency. So what we try to do is we'll lay out our zoning, and then we'll try to get on a call with the engineer before they start specifying the emergency lighting and say, hey, look, these downlights are only 6 watts each. You can put this entire row of 20 downlights on your emergency circuit, and that will be the emergency circuit for the room. When we're able to have those conversations, and then that prevents us from having an additional zone here and there for all these for the emergency and the non-emergency and the alternating downlights of this one's non-emergency, this one's emergency. So we try to have those conversations of saying, look, let's try and use our zoning and try to break up our zones into as few additional zones for emergency as possible. Like if we can use that entire zone as the emergency zone for this room, great. And a lot of times we're able to have those conversations, and sometimes the engineer will say, well, we only have capacity on the generator for this much on emergency, so we're going to have to break that up a little bit. And then we'll sit down with them and say, all right, well, let's look at which fixtures we're actually going to put on emergency, because it doesn't make sense to put a 4-foot run of this 6-foot linear fixture on emergency when we could just put the whole linear fixture on emergency. And rather than having hot spot, dark spot, hot spot, right, dark spot as you're walking down the corridor. But we do put a very strong emphasis on actually making sure that, hey, let's make anything that is on emergency, it has to have UL 1008, UL 924 devices to be able to be fully controlled under a non-emergency situation. We definitely run into issues sometimes with engineers who don't fully get the reason why we want to be able to control emergency lights. They'll say, well, this is an elevator lobby. We need to have the lights on at a certain level anyway, so let's just not control them. It's just going to be on emergency. It'll be on at 100% no matter what. We say, well, this is an elevator lobby in a very high-end hotel. You don't want these 3 downlights in the middle of the lobby at 100% when it's 3 a.m. and someone's trying to take the elevator in their hotel. We want to be able to dim those down and still meet the right light level requirements that we need to have there, but you don't need 50-foot candles in the elevator lobby in the middle of the night. There's a reason why we're trying to save energy. We're both trying to save energy, and we're trying to preserve a design aesthetic of this is what the system should look like. So we try to take as much ownership as we can with the emergency lighting, but at the end of the day, we aren't the ones stamping the drawings. So most engineers are willing to work with us to an extent, and we're able to kind of sit down and figure out, okay, let's make your emergency requirements work with our lighting control design. And it usually comes out working the way that we wanted it to, but there is only so much that we can do at the end of the day.
Sure.
But it is interesting to be able to be in the position that that I'm in, of being able to help educate a lot of these engineers, of saying, well, this device actually functions in this way. That is not the way that you seem to be thinking that it works. So let's be smart about where we're using these devices and how we're using these devices.
And that's got to be a lot easier to have conversation too, regarding, especially with DMX, right? Anything that's a directly controlled luminaire, and making sure that you can talk to the engineer about how your control system can properly handle the dimming for those and the emergency for those, because that's a lot of that stuff the engineers don't understand, right? Like you said, they're just going to power it and they just want to go to 100%. They don't understand if there's DMX or how that all works. So it must be a lot easier because they don't understand your control system as well. So to work through that with them in that process.
Exactly. Because I mean, a lot of the engineers that we work with have a handful of control systems they've worked with fairly well, and fairly regularly, but there are some systems that we specify for a particular reason that they've just never even looked at before. So they don't know what this weird serial code of numbers and letters means. And we say, well, I know what that device is, and it is doing this specific purpose in this system. We need that there. And because we have that, we can eliminate all these additional shunt devices that you put further down the stream of putting a shunt device on every single relay that you decide needs to be on emergency. Like, let's take a smart approach to how we're actually using these devices, and let's try to be efficient about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. So ultimately taking full ownership of the lighting controls is the goal here. I mean, you're not trying to sever out components and say, well, that's not us. You're really taking that full grab. And I think as a result, you're defending the design of the control intent as best as you can. Like you said, you're not,
and the lighting design
drawings and the lighting design as a whole. And so you're not,
and beyond that, even the architectural design, because the lighting is there to enhance the architecture. Yes. And if the lighting is not functioning the way that it is intended to function in that space, the entire architectural and the interior design for that space starts losing out on a lot of its value.
And so, I mean, your service is really value added. And I would say that that's a benefit of working with your firm, is that you have somebody such as yourself who's dedicated to this. It may not be a profitable venture necessarily from a project by project basis, but it is for assurance value and guarantee of success, because somebody is standing there saying, yes, I am in control of this, I am taking ownership of this, and if things go wrong, you call me and we'll figure it out. Whereas in other projects, it can be like Ron said, nobody's there, and as a result, it's just a finger pointing game of, well, no, you did this, but you said that, and then it just never gets resolved.
Yeah, exactly. And we are really trying to help push that idea to the firms that we work with and the clients that we're working with. Of there's a reason that you should be working with us from a lighting, both a lighting design standpoint, because we have 40 plus years of experience designing lighting for a variety of spaces, but also because, unlike a lot of other firms that have been out there for a lot of years, we are specifically focusing on how the controls are going to work and how we are tying in the lighting at that intersection of the architecture and the environment and the people, of how this system will work, how it's going to really benefit the user at the end of the day. And what we're trying to do is really grow that into an understanding of, hey, you can work with us not just because you like the way we design lights, but you might just want to work with us from a controls design standpoint. I mean, we've definitely worked with some clients where we'll look at help them understand the control system that they're working with. Or we have a client who has an existing system and say that we're working with them on another project where we're designing, but they're saying, hey, our other building that we've had for 15 years, can you explain what's going on with our lighting control system? And we'll go in and say, well, this is what you have here. Can work the way that you want it to, but it isn't currently because you're missing this component. If you spend $200 and add this one device in here and just update the firmware on your system, you can do a lot more than you were doing previously. So we're really trying to work with a lot of our clients that we have relationships with, of saying, let's look at what you have already so that you don't need to look at your system and say, we've had it for 20 years and certain things aren't functioning the way we want it to, so let's just gut the whole thing and replace all these panels with some new equipment. Which sometimes that's the solution, but sometimes it's, well, what if you just replace these two components? Now you're saving a lot of money and you're really getting the benefits out of your system that the system was originally, it may not have been fully intended to function that way, but it had those capabilities that some people just aren't really tapping into.
I mean, that I think is like your marketing brief right there. Like,
Yes.
if I were like a building owner right now listening to that, I'd be like, I need to get this guy's number. But as far as, I mean, going further down the road of what you do ultimately, I mean, what about like custom content? Like, if you're doing a big multimedia experience, do you develop that content?
It depends on exactly what we're looking at. Like if we're talking about like some sort of decorative lighting fixture that's going to have some inputs from taking occupancy data or photocell data and responding to the active environment, there's some of that work that we do to an extent. Within our design firm, there's a sister company, Pixelumen Lab, that we work closely with that focuses a lot more on that multimedia design, and I'll work with them frequently on, hey, let's look at how we can make this whole multimedia display of how the lighting and is going to. They're working on a project right now where they're looking at, they have occupancy sensors all over the place, way more than they actually need, but they're all finely tuned to specific areas. And there's all these lighting fixtures that are wirelessly controlled, that are tied to a particular sensor. So as someone moves through the space, those sensors are responding. So I'll kind of work with them sometimes of providing guidance of, let's see how that control system is going to work. They do more of the programming of on that side of things, and the actual installation and integration of how those components come together. But we definitely do some of that work of working out these custom systems that function in a certain way. And when we look at some of our bigger projects that we'll do, like convention centers and large hotels, we'll definitely, where there is a lot of DMX or a lot of Dolly fixtures out there, we'll we'll really do a deep, detailed documentation on how are we addressing these fixtures, how are they going to function, what sort of level of customization can the end user do, what level of customization do we not want them to be able to do so that the system will continue functioning for years without getting broken. So in some ways, yes, we do work with some of these custom design pieces, but it's a
it
little bit
sounds
different.
like that's
It's a
really,
different approach.
yeah, it sounds like that's more of a collaborative effort with an integrator or a programmer that has the ability and capacity to do that programming.
Exactly. Yeah, we don't do a lot of that programming within our firm, but we help provide a lot of the guidance and the direction on what that's going to look like to the user in the space and the physical components that need to get put into that so that it will function the way that the design intent is supposed to work.
Well, and it sounds like there's a lot of design drawings that get involved when you're doing a much more complex custom controls design. It's not your typical one-line diagram and that's it.
Yeah, so if we're looking, I'll use a guest room as an example. Like if we're looking at a high-end hotel guest room that isn't just going to be a keypad on the wall with a couple preset scenes. We're looking at something that has full guest presence detection, motion sensors on night lights so that people can, if they get out of bed in the middle of the night, a small little step light will light up. It'll detect that motion, light up, and track people as they get over to the bathroom in the middle of the night without blasting them with any light. A system that's going to integrate with the shades and the AV and have some sort of preset welcome scene when they walk into the room. We'll document that kind of level of functionality with the integrator for those hotels and say, hey, look, this is how this is going to work. Here's all the components that need to go into it. You'll have to figure out how to program it so that it'll do that, but we will lay out all of the actual physical devices that you will need to make that work. And we'll explain exactly how that will work. And that will go into our documentation of this is how this particular guest room is going to function, or something like that.
So it sounds, just to sort of tie back a little, it sounds like you guys spend a lot of time in education, right? Education with the engineers, education with the owners, when you can have those conversations with the owners. So where you're very focused on the end user, right, and that experience, I'm just curious, we hear a lot from various firms that, unfortunately, most design firms are in the front of the project and then they're gone, right? The project gets taken over, the electricians leave, it gets programmed, and a lot of times the design firms are well out of the project at that point. But it seems like you've got such a sort of tight hold on wanting to make sure that the intent is fully focused. Do you guys stay on longer through the end of the project to sort of do a commissioning at the end, or not a commissioning, but go through and make sure your design intent was met and that the owner's happy?
Yes, is the short answer. The long answer is it will obviously depend on various factors that are out there. I mean, there's only so much we can do at the end of the day if we are if we are billed out in the project, and there's not much we can't fly out to a site in Florida that we need to go and try to provide a little bit more guidance. We can't get that level, but we try to. What we do is we have a 6-month follow-up and a 1-year follow-up. Usually it's just an email to the owner like, hey, how's the system working? Is everything working the way you want it to? And for a lot of our local projects, we'll come and check in with them and just walk them through. And they're saying, well, this space isn't functioning the way that we want it to. The lights aren't turning on in this restroom when you walk in. We'll look in and say, oh, well, just move that sensor, that wireless sensor that you can easily relocate. Just move it 2 feet closer to the door and you're all set. And we'll provide that level of guidance and service well after occupancy. I was actually just at a site last week that we were on site for scene setting about a year ago. And there were some outstanding issues, and we just followed up with ownership just to say, hey, did these issues ever get resolved? The answer was no. So we're saying, okay, well, let's look at what we can do to get to bring the controls manufacturer back out to site because they owe you a full commissioning. There are services on that bill of materials that haven't been used yet. We want to be your advocate and make sure that you're actually getting everything that you paid for at the end of the day, and everything that you deserve to get your system functioning the way that you do. So rather than being I would argue that we definitely we are sometimes more involved later in the design process than we may be early on in design when we get brought onto a project later. Like we will stay well after the project has been installed and work to make sure that everything's actually functioning the way that that system should be working. And honestly, the way that I see it, that is how a controls design should be carried out. I mean, the controls are only going to evolve as you get used to the space, and you're going to need to have that follow-up visit to make sure that things are really working the way that the client wanted it to. Maybe they thought that they wanted a particular room to be set to occupancy, but they realized, well, this light is turning on every time I walk past this door. Can we do something about that? Well, yeah, let's just change the settings on that sensor to vacancy, and you'll have to manually turn on the light, but that'll get your level of control back to where you are, what you actually want to be getting out of this space.
I mean, I also, like Ron, I'm just loving everything that I'm hearing here.
Everything.
So, I mean, but the thing here that I hear also argument-wise is that what you're telling me, it sounds very expensive from a billable standpoint.
Oh, boo.
Why are we bringing money into this?
I know, right? We were having a conversation.
Let's just live in the dream world where money has no involvement in anything we do.
Exactly. I mean, there is, at the end of the day, there is cost to a lot of these services that we are offering from a controls design standpoint, but the benefits, in our opinion, really outweigh any cost. You could spend a little bit of money now to have a system that'll be functioning the way you want it to for 10, 15, 20 years. And you won't need to have technicians and contractors constantly coming back in to fix things that if we take the time to actually make sure that it's working the way that it should be, you'll be set for a long time. And that's kind of what we try to make clear to our clients of, this is what this is our philosophy and this is our approach. We want to make sure that you're getting the best system that you can get and the best functionality from those controls. Sometimes it's a hard sell, but other times we see people who understand the value in it and realize, yeah, let's work on how we're going to pay for this up front and get that stuff figured out early on so that later we don't need to worry about all these headaches. And from an architect standpoint, there's a lot of our architects, when they realize that we're willing to take on this level of control, they say, oh my God, yes, please. We don't want to have to think about how the shade system is going to work with the BMS system and the lighting control system. You guys figure it out. Great. Do it. Let's make that work. So once we kind of get that, kind of going back to that education and being a missionary for the lighting controls, we are able to get those get the ball rolling on a lot of those things of, hey, let's figure out let's understand the value in working with a controls designer to make sure that the system is working and we're getting what we want out of it.
Well, we're almost out of time here, but I just want to encapsulate everything we've talked about here because it's really cool stuff. And I hope our listeners are paying attention and taking notes, because this really sounds like the way that it should be done, at least if there is a lighting controls designer. So, I mean, that's the title of your job. And what that means is that you are in charge of the controls for the lighting controls for the entire project, through and through, as much as you can legally be in charge of it. You know, there are going to be points where you have to give guidance as opposed to dictate what's done. But ideally, you would be able to give guidance enough that it is your equipment or the equipment that you want that is going to be implemented on the project. And that as a result, you'll get the intent you want out of the lighting control system, and that protects you, protects the lighting design, the architecture, the whole project. In some cases, you're really a defense measure to making sure that things are done effectively and successfully, and that the owner is happy in the end with what they have. And because of that, you do need to coordinate a lot. You need to talk to a lot of people, and pretty much anybody who's going to have any interaction with the lighting control system, either from a design or installation or operation standpoint, needs to understand what it is that you're requesting, because it's complex. It's not simple stuff anymore when it comes to lighting controls. But I would say that further identifies that you're not just a lighting controls designer, you're an integration designer, because you make sure that the handshakes between unrelated systems are vetted, clarified, and specified. And so that takes a lot of effort, a lot of time. And so this is time that the lighting designer doesn't have to dedicate to, the architect doesn't have to dedicate to, the electrical engineer doesn't have to, all these people are freed up to actually do the jobs that they originally signed on to do, so that, and you focus specifically on this one aspect that gives a lot of people heartburn when they think about it. So, there's a huge value add to having someone like you involved in a project. And it's like what Ron does as an integrator to a degree, but because you're not in the construction side of things, you also get to maintain an agnostic level of presence to everything. So you can dive into those projects where it's like, yeah, you just need that little, $100 device, and then all your problems go away. So, there's really great stuff in here that you do, and I really wish you all of the luck in going forward with this initiative that is, it seems, based on what you're saying, is it's a trial run, but it sounds like it's a successful trial so far. It sounds like it's really giving your firm a value that is very competitive to other firms.
Yeah, definitely. And we hopefully that this controls design philosophy will continue to grow in the industry, and more people will recognize the value of controls design. And it definitely was a trial run for us at first, but it's definitely growing. We have one of our newer designers is also part-time on team controls. She dedicates a week of her time focusing just on controls, which is great, we're able to kind of grow that controls department within the controls studio within our firm. So hopefully as this gains a little bit more traction and more people are recognizing the importance and the value of an integrated controls design, we're only able to continue to grow this this education resource and really bring some more value to the industry and the projects that we work on.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. Really appreciate you coming in and telling us all about this. And hopefully we'll get you back in here to get an update on where things are at in the future.
Yeah, really appreciate you having me on here.
All right. Well, thanks, Ben. That was a fantastic conversation. We appreciate you coming on. As you can tell, we loved everything about that episode. Can't wait to have Ben back on again in the future. But just want to remind everyone that this week's episode is presented by the LCA, the Lighting Controls Association,
and financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, or NAILD. Again, check out our website, lightingcontrolspodcast.com, for any episodes that you haven't listened to, or if you want to listen to some episodes again, or check out some news that we have there. We have some great news feed going on all the time, and we've got some great merch for you to buy if you want to support the podcast. But in all seriousness, thank you so much, Ben. Awesome conversation, and thank you, everyone.